Tov. We're on Daf Nun Aleph, towards the bottom of Amud Aleph, about 4 lines before it gets wide on the bottom. Ki Asa Rabba Bar Chana. And we'll give you a little bit of an introduction to the sugya. We're talking again, as we've discussed earlier, about picking up a minhag when you come to a place that has a certain minhag. Let's say you leave a place where you were makil, and you come to a place where you're machmir, is we impose upon you the chumras of the minhag of the place where you landed. And we're going to discuss now the iser of chelev. Now we're talking about a behema tahora, and the Torah says the following. First, with regard to karbanos, if you have a behema tahora and it's going to be brought onto the mizbeach, the Torah says in Vayikra Zayin, kol chelev shar v'kesev va'ez lo sochelu. And therefore, the Torah says, ki kol ochel chelev min behema shar yakru mimenu ishe l'Hashem v'nichras ha'nefesh ocheles me'amel. So the Torah prohibits behemos tahoros, but only with regard to chelev of behemoth kodshim. And we'll see that we're going to have a discussion, and it's going to be a major issue about behemoth kodshim, which is brought on the mizbeach, and that's called, the chelev is called a murim. What exactly is prohibited and is included on the chelev? The Torah says, with regard to a korban shlomim, in the 3rd chapter of Vayikra, it says, "V'ekriv mizevach hashlamim, ishel Hashem, v'eskol hachelev asher al hakerev." And here we have a machlokas between Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva. And the sugya is in Chulin on Daf Mem Tes Amud Beis. According to Rabbi Yishmael, included in what the Torah calls chelev al hakerev is chelev hakeva, the chelev that surrounds the stomach, and chelev hakeva is aser b'achila. Rabbi Akiva says, on the other hand, that when it says in the pasuk chelev asher karev, it's not referring to the chelev on the keva, because the chelev on the keva is mutar b'achila. Now the Gemara in Masechet Menachos and also Masechet Chulin analyzes the shita of Rabbi Akiva. Does Rabbi Akiva really mean that chelev hakeva is mutar? I mean, the Torah is pretty outspoken about it. Kol chelev ashar al hakerev, the Torah prohibits achila. So the Gemara analyzes Rabbi Akiva, and he says that we're not talking about all the chelev on the keva. That's not the subject of the machlokas tanoim between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shmuel. There are 2 parts to the chelev on the keva. One part, even Rabbi Akiva agrees, is asur. But then there's another part of the chelev hakeva, which Rabbi Akiva disagrees with. Now, what are these 2 parts of the chelev that surround the keva? The keva itself is described as asuya kemin keshes. In other words, the keva itself is like a bow. And around this bow, on both sides of the keva, there is chelev. Now, one side is called the akashta. Akashta is Aramaic for keshes, and that's called chelev hakeshes. I have a diagram And if you look at this diagram, again, I can't show it to you because it's not a very good diagram. But the Chelev HaKeshes is also according to everybody, and that's the inner lining. So we have in the keva, we have one inner lining, which is called the Chelev HaKeshes, which goes around this bow-shaped stomach. And that for sure is included on the Chelev, even according to Rabbi Akiva. And that's what the Torah says, HaChelev Asher Al HaKerev. However, there's another part of Chelev, which is called the Isra, otherwise known in Hebrew as Chelev HaYeser. And in the picture that I have, although the Chelev HaKeshes is sort of surrounds on the outer rim the keva, when you go closer towards the keva itself, in what's called the tzad hapnimi, in the inner side, then you get to what's called Chelev HaYeser, otherwise known in Aramaic as the Isra. And on this Chelev, which is called Chelev the Isra, the Gemara records a machlokas between Rabbi Shmuel, who asers it, he prohibits it. He understood that a Chelev Asher HaKerev includes all the Chelev, whether it's on the inner side, which is called Chelev HaYeser, or the Isra, or whether it's on the outer side, which is called Chelev HaKeshes or the Akshasa, both are included in the Isra. Rabbi Akiva, on the other hand, says that the Isra is only on the Chelev, which is the Akshasa, which is the outer Chelev of the Keshes. And the Chelev HaYeser, one second, let me get this straight one more time. The Chelev HaYeser, right, is the Chelev that Rabbi Akiva is going to be matir. I'm sorry, let me get this again. The Chelev that's on the outside, which is called the Chelev, the Akshasa of the Keshes, is clearly also. Oh, okay, so I did get it right. But the machlokes is going to be about the Chelev HaYeser, the Isra, which, as I said before, is an inner lining around the keva. Now, how do we paskin? That's what, now, this was all just a segue to our sugya. Do we accept Rabbi Akiva's kula or Rabbi Shmuel's chumrah as far as Chelev the Isra? So here we have two different traditions. We have the minhag of Bnei Eretz Yisrael and the minhag of Bnei Bavel. The Bnei Bavel were machmir. They accepted the shita of Rabbi Shmuel. The Bnei Eretz Yisrael were mekil, and they accepted the shita of Rabbi Akiva. So now the Gemara tells us a story about Rabba bar Chana. Okay, so we're 4 lines before the wide lines on Nun Al. He also Rabba bar Chana. Rabba bar Chana came from Eretz Yisrael, where they were mekil like Rabbi Akiva, and they ate the Chelev the Isra. And he came to Bavel, where they were machmir like Rabbi Shmuel. Achal the Isra. And he continued his minhag of Eretz Yisrael, even in Bavel. And he ate Chelev the Isra. Now, I would have assumed that he did it very privately. You know, he locked up the door. Because there in Bavel, they were machmir. This was considered an Isa Dorais of Chelev, based on Rabbi Shmuel. However, apparently he didn't lock the door, you know, with 2 locks, maybe only locked it with 1 lock. And Ol Gabe, 2 of the great Tanoim, Amoraim of Bavel, came in to see him just at that moment when he, Rabba bar Chana, was eating Chelev the Isra. And that was Rav Avira, the elder Rav Avira, the Rabba Braid Rav Huna. So now we have 2 Amoraim who are, in a sense, catching him, you know, red-handed, Ema the Chazinu, when he saw that they came in, Hasye Minayu, he covered over the chalev so that they shouldn't see him eating it. Because in Bavel they were knowing Isa like Rabbi Shmuel, but they actually saw him before he got a chance to cover it over. Now, Asu the Amrule Labai. This Gemara I'm not sure about, but I'm going to tell you what I think is pshat, and it's up to you. You'll decide. I have a feeling that they told Abaye not because they wanted to tattletale. It wasn't together lashon hara chilus harav barachana, but they wanted to understand how he could possibly be makil in Bavel. Let me go a step further. They were confused about another issue. If indeed Rabba Barachana, paskening like the Bnei Eretz Yisrael, was makil in Chalev the Isra like Rabbi Akiva, then he would have understood, in his opinion, meaning in Rabba's opinion, that we here at Bavel are making a mistake. That our chumrah, paskening like Rabbi Shmuel, is shalom kedin. Our tradition in Eretz Yisrael is that we accept the sheet of Rabbi Akiva. Now, here we get into another issue. What happens if you're a Talmud Chacham, you have a status of a Mora Hora, you have a tradition of Psak, and you find that people are acting otherwise? Their minhag reflects a chumrah, which a lo al pi did. And if you recall the Gemara that we had on Yom Chamishi, this discussed a case where they were mafresh truma from a dough made of rice, a rice dough, and even though they accepted that chumrah, the chachamim would not tolerate such a chumrah, and they were materit bifneihem, and they said, we're going to be makil in front of you, and we're going to try to undermine this minhag. And the Gemara, if you recall, objected. How can you do such a thing? We have a principle called Dvarim she'acherim noagim b'hem iser, iyat harashay la'atira b'fneihem. They took upon themselves the chumrah, that it's tevel and it needs hafrasha, even though it's a dough that's made of rice flour. So how can you be matur b'fneihem? So the Gemara says that the halacha of Rav Chizda, that principle that you're not allowed to be matur, is something that others are machmir on in front of them, even though you know it's mutter. That only applies to kusayim. Now, the kusayim, if you recall, were a category. We're not talking about kusim. I mean, we are talking about kusim, but the word kusai in this context means amaratzim, those who really have no orientation in halacha, and if you're going to be making them on what they think is asur, they're going to mistakenly make analogies and then come to all sorts of conclusions, and at the end they'll be matir and make it on something that's actually asur mikra din. So it works like this. If you're dealing with a community or a group of Talmidei Chacham and you come to this community, you arrive, and lo and behold, they have a chumrah, and they are stringent about something that you know, based on your Kabbalah, your hara, and the tradition that you have, they are making a mistake, and it's really asur. So in such a case, you can go ahead and continue your psak, your kula, and you don't have to worry about the fact that if they understand from you that it's lakula, that the halacha is lenient and permissible, therefore they're going to make equations and analogies and come to mistaken conclusions. Why? Because they are, to some extent, scholars, or at least they're oriented in halacha. Let's give them that much credit. Masha Enke Rav Chisda's principle of Iyata Rashoy Lahatira B'fneim, that applies to Kusayim, to ignorant people. Because if you're going to tell them that what they think is usher is really mutter, they're going to come to be matir things that are really usher al pi din. Now, in the light of that introduction, we begin to understand why these two Amoraim, Rav Avira and Rabba Bered Rav Huna, came to Abaye. In a certain sense, if I can use this term, they were complaining to Abaye. Why? Because why did Rabba Bar Bar Chana, when he ate the chalev that we think is also here in Bavel, but he knows it's mutter, the Isra, because of the Pesachim of Rabbi Akiva, why did he cover it up? Why did he hide it in our presence? Apparently, he was activating the principle of Rav Chisda of Iyat HaRashoy La'atiram B'fneim. But Rav Chisda's principle, we've already established, only applies to Kutzayim. This is not very honorable. He's not really giving us the credit. He's afraid that if he'll be matir, this chalev, the Isra, in our presence, will come to be matir some other chalev, which is awesome. Maybe even the chalev of Rabbi Akiva, the chalev, the akshasa. Also, the Amalei Abaye. So they tell the story of Abaye that Rabba was very secretive and he concealed the chalev, the Isra, because he didn't want to be martyred in front of them. Amalahu. So Abaye responds, very strange story. Shavinchu kikusoi. He considers you like kusoi. And this, by the way, might be a little bit typical of the attitude of the Bnei Eretz Yisrael towards the Bavlian. There are many statements all over Shas about the Bavlian, that they weren't the first rate. So in any event, according to Abaye's interpretation of this whole behavior pattern of Rabba Bar Bar Chana, Rabba had considered them as Kusayim, and he had activated the principle of Dvar Mutar V'Acher Nogu Bem Iser Iyat HaRashoy Latir B'fneim, and we interpreted that principle in the light of Rav Chisda's statement that that's only in the case of Kusayim or ignorant, because in the case of ignorant, again, if you'll be matir them, that which they think is also, they're going to come to be matir that which is really also, and that's how he related to you. Now, at this point in the Gemara, we can wonder why Rabba Bar Chana related to the rabbis in Bavel as Kusayim, and that certainly is something valid. In the footnote here, he quotes the Marshal, and the Marshal says that Lo Rotza Rabba Bar Chana lahakil b'fneim, he concealed the chalev of the Isra. He didn't want to be makil. And why mechashash shehem yikablu es haheter lahakil b'zeh umirov charifusa upilpulam. The whole other pshat here of the Marshal. Yavo lahatir afilu chalev ha'asur mi'ikar adin. Very, very paradoxical, almost antithetical concept that mitoch rov charifusa. It's like the Gemara says, I forgot which Amora it was, who said that he could come up with 50 explanations to be matir sheretz, to be matira sheretz, that a sheretz is not matama. Using all the different kavachomers. So it seems that the Marshal understood that Rabba suspected that if he would be noe kula as far as the chalev of the Isra in their presence, they would draw the conclusion that this chalev of the Isra is mutter, and then with their pilpul and their charifus, they would derive conclusions even about chalev that's awesome. So in a funny sort of sense, the Marshal puts almost an opposite spin on this Gemara. We read the Gemara as to say, that Rabbi was telling these two great rabbis that that Rabba bar Chana didn't think so highly of you. He thought that you were such a maratzim that you fit into the category of Kusoy, but the Marshal puts it into a slightly different perspective, that mitol charifusam, they would come to be matir chelev that's also mi'ikra. Again, this kind of an attitude of rabbis coming from here, as far as rabbis coming from there, I'm sure you've encountered that in your lifetime. That kind of almost like a little bit of a condescending attitude. I know my Rebbe had a little bit of an attitude towards American Rabbanim. He came from Europe. He came from, an atmosphere of Chaslavich and Brisk. And when he came to America, he really kind of assumed that every American rabbi was an Amoritz by definition. I remember I was with my father once. At the end of the Archei Kala, you remember Rav Soloveitch used to give a series of 3-4 days of shiur to the Rabbinical Council of America. So at the end of the Archei Kala that year in the 70s, Rav Soloveitch comes over to my father and he says, Rabbi Berson, get together 2 other rabbis because I have to be matir neder. I'm just not sure if I'll be able to stand for the entire Chazoros Hashatz on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. So I don't know if you knew my father, he was a jokester. And he says to the Rav, he says, Rebbe, why do you need 2 other rabbis? Ich bin a Yochid Mumche. So the Rav said to him, as du seid a Yochid Mumche, weiß ich nicht. Aber als sie seinen Hediotis, bin ich sicher. Hediotis is like another word for an Amoritz, But now we have another problem. Now this is even a more fundamental problem. Forget about the issue of Dvarim Shacherim Naguba and Isa. What about the issue of Makom Shahalach L'sham? The Mishnah says that you cannot continue your kulos. Like the Mishnah says, I come from an area where they do malacha on Erev Pesach before Chatzos in the morning of the 14th. And now I show up in an area where they abstain from malacha based on the minhag that we don't do malacha on Erev Pesach. But I have to pick up their minhag. So how could Rabba in Bavel continue to eat chelev the Isra when that chelev, according to the minhag in Bavel, paskening like Rabbi Shmuel, is awesome? What about the halacha of makom shenagu? That's a pretty serious problem. I wanted to assume that maybe he locked the door, but the Gemara doesn't assume so. In fact, the Gemara of Rabba bar Chana, Leslie Hadisnat, what does he do with the Mishnah? Our Mishnah here, Nostim Olav Chumrei HaMakom Sheyatzom Chumrei HaMakom Shehalach L'sham. So if he ends up in Bavel, he's not allowed to eat that chelev, which they consider an Isa D'Oraisa to eat, the chelev the Isra. Now, in order to understand the Gemara's answer, we have to know something about smicha. In Eretz Yisrael, it was an unbroken chain of smicha, even at the time of the Gemara. And it was ish mipi ish, dating back to Moshe Rabbeinu at Har Sinai. Whereas in Bavel, the Dayanim in Bavel did not have the status of musmachim. They didn't have smicha. And the Gemara establishes in Masechet Sanhedrin that aim donim dine knasos b'Bavel. Because for knas, let's say kefel of a ganav or dal v'hei, etc., all the many examples of knas, you need smuchim. And in Bavel, they didn't have smuchim. There was a break in the chain of smicha. Okay. Now, Omar Abaye. Abaye says the following, that in 3 out of 4 cases, we're going to apply the principle of the Mishnah and nogim olav chumrei hamakom shahalach l'sham. But in 1 out of 4 cases, the principle of our Mishnah does not apply. Let's go through the cases. Amar Abai Hani Mili, when do we apply this principle? That you have to pick up the chumras of the makom, shehalach l'sham. That's mi Bavel leBavel, from one city to another in Bavel, or the Eretz Yisrael, meaning Eretz Yisrael, meaning from one city in Eretz Yisrael to another. Inami, a third possibility where we'll apply this principle that you have to pick up the chumrah of the makom shalach l'sham is mi Bavel li Eretz Yisrael. So a Babylonian Jew in Eretz Yisrael is compelled to be noeg l'chumrah like the Israelis. I mean, you'll see how this impacts on Yom Tov Sheni Shel Golios. Avol, here's the fourth case, and this is the exception to the rule, says Abaye. The Eretz Yisrael of Bavel, like Rabba Babrachana, who found himself now in Bavel, and his minhag from Eretz Yisrael was to eat chelev the Isera, Hevan Danan Kaifinan Lahu is Avdinan Kavasai. Now, what that means is Kaifinan, literally in Hebrew, means kfufim. We are subject to Eretz Yisrael. In other words, the Israelis, so to speak, the Eretz Yisrael have an unbroken smicha, and therefore they and their dayanim have a superior status. Now let's understand what that means. First and foremost, what it means is that the dayanim in Eretz Yisrael are in charge of the calendar, which means they are Makadish the Chodesh, they are Ma'abra the Shana, we are Kafuf. In Bnei Bavel, we have no right to disagree with the dayanim in Eretz Yisrael about when Rosh Chodesh is and when there'll be a Shana Muberes. Number two, because they have smicha in Eretz Yisrael, they can judge knossos, but dayanim Bnei Bavel are not smuchim, they cannot judge knossos. And therefore, in this context, that the Bnei Eretz Yisrael have an unbroken tradition, we are kafuf. We are, so to speak, secondary to them, subjugated to them. And therefore, Avdinon Kavasayu, and the Nafkamina says Habayf, in addition to the ones that we mentioned already, is that if you have Bnei Eretz Yisrael that come to Bavel, they are allowed to continue their minhag of Eretz Yisrael. And here, Rashi, Dibra Maschal Avdinon, adds another element into the equation. You take a look, Rashi says, Avdinon Kavasayu, about 4 lines up from the bottom, Klomar im boy misham lekan, they come from Eretz Yisrael here to Bavel, ein lahem l'shanos min hagam, ela osim kimakomon. They can continue the minhag that they had in Eretz Yisrael. And the question here is, why is that so? I mean, after all, the Mishnah says, Al Yishanim Mipnei Machlokes, right? If you continue your heter from wherever you came to this area, this location where you relocated, and they are noeg l'chumra, then you're creating machlokes. And the answer is that anan kaifinan lahu. Since we are subject to their, so to speak, their decision. Now, what I'm about to say really is a combination of 2 Rashis. If you take a look at the previous Rashi, Rashi says, Hani mili mi Bavel leBavel mi ir li'ir beBavel. The Kavan de lo kaifi la dadi. One city in Bavel has no control in halachic normative decisions over another city in Bavel. Is therefore im yeshanim in hogam leinehem yeshkan mipnei hamachlokas v'kol shkein mi Bavel li Eretz Yisrael al yeshanes es minhag hamokum mipnei hamachlokas. Avol mi Eretz Yisrael le Bavel. This is the Rashi that I meant to emphasize before. Im Yeshanes minag mi Bavel, bib Bavel, right? So he's an Eretz Yisrael, who a Ben Eretz Yisrael who finds himself in Bavel. Ein kan machlokas. This halach of kaifinon will undermine the machlokes. The anan kaifinon lebnei Eretz Yisrael, the inu samchi, they have smucha, ubebavel lo samchi. So according to Rashi's presentation, and right now I don't have an alternative. I looked for someone who would disagree with Rashi, but nobody seems to disagree with Rashi to the best of my knowledge. There is halacha A and halacha B, and one determines the other. A determines the other. Machlokes only applies when there's an element of kaifinon, meaning if you are subject to a higher authority, then you have to avoid shinui because that would create machlokas. But on the other hand, if a Ben Eretz Yisrael comes to Bavel, that's not going to cause machlokas because the Bnei Bavel understand that they are subject, or shall I say secondary in rulings of halacha to the Bnei Eretz Yisrael. So if the Bnei Eretz Yisrael insist on their psak based on their tradition and their mori horon, their dayanin, then they have a right to insist on their psak, and that's not called mishanim mipnei machlokas. And in the footnote, he writes here that if Bnei Bavel are olimly Eretz Yisrael, noagim k'minig Eretz Yisrael. In other words, they drop them in hagim from Bavel and they accept them in hagim of Eretz Yisrael. And that's called kavasayu di Eretz Yisrael. But here in our case, we're talking about Rabba bar Chana coming from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, and he is permitted to continue the minhag of Eretz Yisrael in Bavel of eating chelev di Eiser. However, Rav Ashi is not on board. He wants to offer another explanation of the heter that Rabba bar Chana was noeg in Bavel to continue to eat chelev di Eisera k'minhag Eretz Yisrael. Afilu teimim Eretz Yisrael Bavel, even if you'll argue there's going to be machlokas. You know, the Babylonians are not going to be very happy about the fact that the Eretz Yisrael that come to visit them in Bavel are showing off their own minhagim, flouting the fact that they have a greater Mesorah from Har Sinai. So there might be machlokas. But Hani Mili, Rav Ashi wants to revolutionize our understanding of the Mishnah. Our Mishnah here at the beginning of the fourth parak of Pesachim. When do we say that you're going to have to take up the chumrah of the place where you're located? And now at this point, it seems like Rav Ashi is totally oblivious to the Mishnah itself. And the Mishnah itself says that the reason for these chumras is because of Mishanim Ibnei Machlokas. But we'll get back to that in just a minute, how Rav Ashi is going to deal with the Mishnah. But forget about the Mishnah. Forget about Shelo Yishanim Ibnei Machlokas. There will be Machlokas, but that's not the issue. That's not the reason why the Mishnah insists that you pick up the chumrah of the place that you find yourself and you drop your minhag from the location, your how does it say by Avram Avinu, mimoladiti, right, to be Beis Avi, is heicha di ein daito lachsa. We're talking about a person in the Mishnah who has relocated himself. He has no intention to return to his original home. Then the Mishnah says he wants to continue his old minhagim. That's those are the customs he's very familiar and comfortable with. No, he has now relocated himself. Forget about all your minhagim. Erase them and start from scratch. Pick up the local minhagim. The Rabba bar Chana, who is eating chelev hayeser, is daito lachsa. He was in the category of an individual who intended to go back to Eretz Yisrael. he was not remaining in Bavel, and hence he's not obligated to pick up the minhagim of Bavel. And it would seem from Rav Ashi that the same would apply in reverse. If one of the Babylonians would visit Eretz Yisrael on a temporary basis, he would not be obligated and compelled to apply the minhag of Eretz Yisrael because it's daito lachsa. Obviously, according to Rav Ashi, you're going to have to reinterpret the Mishnah, because Rav Ashi says that in any direction you're going, it's the same element of machlokas. And therefore, we have to understand, why did the Mishnah add this justification for its ruling of Mipnei HaMachlokas? So let's go back just for one moment to refresh our memories. And the Mishnah says the following. The Mishnah says that Aholech mimakom she'osim l'makom she'ein osim, or mimakom she'ein osim l'makom she'osim, nosim olav chumrei makom she'yotzim l'cha, v'chumrei makom she'alach l'sham. And the very next line, which is on the top of Daf Nun Amid Beis, v'al yeshana adam, he should not deviate from the minhag hamakom mipnei hamachlokas. So what are you telling me? It's daito lachsa? So how does Rav Ashi avoid that? Maybe in a daito lachsa there's no machlokas. We have to come to grips with that. So just to summarize, we have a fundamental machlokas here between Abaye on the one hand and Rav Ashi on the other hand. Abaye thinks that the underlying compelling reason for accepting, or shall I say, for behaving in accordance with the minhag hamakom is because of machlokas. But Abai thinks that there's one case, the way Rashi describes it, where there's no machlokas, and that's the case of a ben Eretz Yisrael like Rabba Bar Chana, who finds himself in Bavel. And the honor and respect and awe that we have for the Torah of Eretz Yisrael and the Dayanim that are smuchim and the Kabbalah ish mipi ish, we have such a Mesorah, that's not going to cause machlokas. People will recognize he's from Eretz Yisrael and he continues his minhag because we are kafuf to Eretz Yisrael. And Rav Ashi says no. Rav Ashi says the same element of machlokas. Rav Ashi doesn't think that with such lamdanim and such scholars that we understand the tradition of Eretz Yisrael, the glorious unbroken chain. No, there's going to be machlokas, but that's not what the Mishnah is all about. And the halacha of accepting a minhag is based on ein daito lachs, that we cancel your original minhagim because, but Rabba Bar Chana had intention to go back, and therefore he's not committed to take upon himself the minhagim above. Now, both say until this point, the Gemara is, I would say, niche kosher, meaning we can understand the Gemara. Now it takes on a more complicated. You should know that on the sugya that we're about to learn, the Igros Moshe, Rav Moshe Feinstein, has tons just on this next little shtickle Gemara. Amalei Rabba Bar Chana Lebrei. Now, Rabba Bar Chana has the direct tradition that this Chaylev the Isra is mutter. His son is in Bavel, and his tradition is indirect. He only knows about the heter of Chaylev the Isra from his father Rabba. So now Rabba, as the father, has to turn to his son and determine whether his son, relying on the father, on him, on Rabba, could continue that minhag even in Bavel. And all these discussions are very halacha l'maisa. B'ni lo tochal lo b'fanai v'lo shelo b'fanai. Do not eat chaylev the Isra, neither in my presence nor when my back is turned. Which means that even in my presence, and I am eating the chaylev the Isra, you're not allowed to take half of the chaylev. You can't eat it with me. Why? Anira Isias Rabbi Yochanan. I have a direct tradition from Rabbi Yochanan. She'achal. he ate chelev hayesem. Hidayu Rabbi Yochanan lismoch olav b'fanav v'shalo b'fanav. Okay, so what happens is, I personally saw, that's what Rabba says, Rabbi Yochanan eating this chelev d'Aisra. Therefore, I'm allowed to eat chelev d'Aisra not only b'fanav, that's half of a kiddush, but even shelo b'fanav, I can continue because I can rely on his, meaning Rabbi Yochanan's logic, his compelling halachic reasoning, and I saw him in his actual implementation of his Horah. So he has a Horah. I saw him implementing the Horah, and now it's mutter for me, bein b'fanav, bein shelo b'fanav. But atah, lo ra'iso so, you never witnessed Rabbi Yochanan eat chelev hayeser, lo tochal, bein b'fanai, bein shelo b'fanav. Okay, now let me try to present to you Rav Moshe Feinstein's understanding of this Gemara.
But before you go on, didn't the son see the father?
Correct. And that's not enough because he didn't see Rabbi Yochanan, and Rabba did not have an original Horah. Rabba was totally relying on Rabbi Yochanan. In other words,
how does tradition work?
well,
How does Masorah work? If not,
I just want to present Rav Moshe Feinstein. It's very complicated. Hopefully, after I present Rav Moshe, maybe I'll be able to answer your question, Rabbi. Maybe, but certainly not before. He says the following: why cannot the son of Rabba bar Chana rely on this heter? After all, we have a tradition of edus. We rely on edim neman. In this case, Rabba bar Chana, his father, has a very reliable status as an aid, and he could testify that he saw Rabbi Yochanan eat the chelev d'Aisra. So Rav Moshe asks, "V'chi Rabba bar Chana eino neman lahayid libno sheRabbi Yochanan achein noag heter b'davar." What are the rules and regulations that govern this halacha that Rabba, who saw Rabbi Yochanan eat the chelev, he can eat the chelev bein b'fanav, bein shelo b'fanav? But the son of Rabba, who didn't see Rabbi Yochanan eat the chelev, although his father Rabba testified, I saw Rabbi Yochanan eat the chelev, and yet Rabba's son cannot eat the chelev neither b'fanav shelo b'fanav. Okay. Now I'm saying a little bit of a kapitel tilim here, because if we get by this, he says the following: Afilu misha higia lahora, so that you might have smicha, but that doesn't automatically mean that just because you have smicha, you could be noeg lekula, unless not only do you have smicha, but you also have horah. Let's understand what horah means. He says, Misha higia lahora, ein bo koch lahoros, ela im yochol lachria mitzad limudo usvarasa. In other words, when I look at this keva and I see these two surrounding, what word shall you, layers of chelev, I don't really have an original svara or mihilchas limud, a definite conclusion as to which chelev is asur or both are asur and which might be mutter. I cannot be machriya in this particular case. Again, there are many other cases, but in this case of chelev, I cannot be machriya not mitzad svara and not mitzad limud. Ubedavar sheina yachal achriya, Eino nechshav bar hora b'davar zeh. Again, the Gavra himself is a bar hora. He's got smichis, royal horas. But every single case has to be judged in and of itself. Are you giving me a hora or you're not giving me a hora? What's a hora? Hora means that you are machriya mikoach your limud, your svar. You analyzed the case and you came to the conclusion it's mut. If he cannot analyze the case and come up with his own original hora, Areu kistam ben adam, and his hora is not a hora. Oh, he says, Afal gav de Rabba bar Bachana bi'atzmo hoyabal hora. No doubt about it. Rabba was from the link, unbroken chain of tradition of Smichi was a bal hora. But b'davar zeh lo yochel achriya. He cannot make a hachra, again, that key word hachra, which is a very heavy word, hachra. Hachra means a process of halachic thinking and an original analysis. Is therefore, with regard to this chelev, eino nechshav lebal hora. It's fascinating. Now, Moshe is claiming that you could be a bal hora for X, Y, and Z, but you're not a bal hora for A, B, and C, because in A, B, and C, you cannot come up with your original analysis, and therefore you're not a bal hora anymore. And your hora is worthless, even though you're a bal hora.
I don't understand.
Achen, what does Rabba bar Bachana have that gives him the right to eat chelev the Isra? Yeshlo Rishus, he says he has Rishus to derive a halach l'maisa from his Rebbe, from Rabbi Yochanan Rabba, because Rabbi Yochanan was a Baal Hora be'inyan chelev hayeser. Yeah, Rabbi said, let's not throw this out. Let's right now, let's accept what Rav Moshe is saying. Rav Moshe is claiming that it's not just that Rabba bar Bachana witnessed Rabbi Yochanan eating chelev hayeser, but rather that Rabbi Yochanan had a hora in which he determined, based on his svara, that chelev hayeser is mutter. V'haya bal hora be'inyan chelev hayeser. Oh, but now, basically, the way Rav Moshe is presenting it, Rabba bar Bachana comes to his Rebbe Rabbi Yochanan. It's not just that he saw Rabbi Yochanan eat chelev hayeser, and he was, so to speak, a very passive student. The Rebbe ate it, so it must be mutter. No. Rabba bar Bachana went one step further, and he specifically asked Rabbi Yochanan, "What is your opinion based on your halachic hachra regarding chelev hayeser?" Eich linog b'zeh. V'hora Rabbi Yochanan leheter. Again, this changes the whole storyline, changing the script. That's not fair, but I'm not Rav Moshe Feinstein, so I couldn't do this, but maybe he can get away with it. It wasn't just that Rabbi bar Bachana witnessed Rabbi Yochanan eating chelev hayeser. He specifically, explicitly asked Rabbi Yochanan for a hora, and that means for an analysis and a derivation to conclude that chelev hayeser is mutter. Ukshahora lo heter zeh nasa davar beheter b'koach hora. So it's not just a heter that's based on testimony, meaning I saw it. Rabosai, you and I know that very often you could see what the Rebbe's doing, and you can draw conclusions. It's a whole different story if you ask the Rebbe specifically, what is the din in this case? Don't just throw it into his face and say, well, Rebbe, I saw you doing X. Try to be choker v'doresh and ask your Rebbe what the logic is. And there are many, all right, I don't want to talk too much about my Rebbe. There were things that, we weren't always so sure about what he did, But if you ask him, then maybe he'll give you a hora. So now, when Rabba asks Rabbi Yochanan, now This heter of eating chelev hayeser is mikoach hora. Once it's mikoach hora, says Rabbi Yochanan, I says Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, then moel gam shelo b'fanav shel Rabbi Yochanan. Meaning that koach hora gives a license, a permission to Rabba bar Chana, once he gets the hora from his Rebbe, to be makil anywhere on the face of the earth, and it doesn't matter whether his Rebbe is there or not there. Avol b'no shel Rabba bar Chana shelo roas Rabbi Yochanan shel ocha. He didn't see Rabbi Yochanan eating, and he has no hora from Rabbi Yochanan. The lo hora lo Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan did not give a hora to the son of Rabba. Lahoros bazeh heta lemaisa. So there was no hora directly from Rabbi Yochanan to the son of Rabba. We should give him a name. I don't know. I don't have his name here. It just says Bray. Umasha roes aviv sha'ochel ein ze nechshav lahora. Why? Again, because Rabba bar Chana had no koach hachra, and therefore he could not be mora hora. He received a hora from Rabbi Yochanan, who was mora hora in this case, but he himself, Rabba bar Chana, had no hora. So his son now watches his father eat chelev hayeser, but he doesn't have hora lehet. What does he have? Yeshlo Yediyah, he knows that Rabbi Yochanan was Mora Het, but he doesn't have a hora because he never got a hora from Rabbi Yochanan. He knows that Rabbi Yochanan was Mora Hora. Is therefore, says Rav Moshe Feinstein, Edo Rashoy Linog Heter Bozer, Kevon Shiodea Shebnei Bavel, Sovrim Shadover Emes. Wow, this is wild. He's saying that the Bnei Bavel had a hora, and he, the son of Rabba, never received a hora. So as far as Rabba bar Chana is concerned, he got the hora from his Rebbe Rabbi Yochanan. And even if the Bnei Bavel had the opposite hora, and they answered Chelev HaYeser, it doesn't matter because Rabba has his hora. But the son of Rabba never received a hora because Rabba himself could not be Mora hora. He did not have the koach hachra that Rabbi Yochanan had in this particular case. So he says, Avon Shebnei Bavel Aim Hamorim Hora Lesar B'Dover Zeh Memele Klapav vis-a-vis the son of Rabba Nechshar of Hadavar L'Safek L'Halach. Now Rabbi Moshe adds another element to the equation. Sfeika D'Oraisa L'Chumra. What happens is that the son of Rabba is caught in betwixt. He knows that Rav Yochanan was Mora Het. He knows that Bnei Bavel were Mora Isa. He's stuck in the middle. Why? Because he doesn't have a hora from his father. Had he had a hora from his father, he wouldn't pay a dime of attention to the hora of the Bnei Bavel. But the problem is that Rabba himself could not be Mora hora. All he could do was testify that Rabbi Yochanan was Mora hora. But as far as the ben of Rabba bar Chana, insofar as he never received the hora, he just knows about the hora. So if you receive a hora from your Rebbe, then you could be noeg l'kula anywhere on the face of the earth, and you could go ahead and eat chelev hayeser shalom b'fanav, just like you do it b'fanav. Why? Because you have a hora from your Rebbe. Your Rebbe was Mora hora, and now you rely on that hora. But that special status only applies to Rabba bar Chana insofar as he received that hora, whereas Rabba never was able to transmit that hora to his son because you can only transmit an original hora. And Rabba bar Chana did not have an original hora because he didn't have the koach to be machriya. All he could do was transmit to his son a yediyah, not a hora, a yediyah that Rabbi Yochanan was Moro Rola. But on the other hand, he is in Bavel, and the son of Rabba is now caught in betwixt. He's got a horah from the Bnei Bavel that they were Moro Ra Le'isur. He's got a horah that he knows about from Rabbi Yochanan, and Rabba is in a special position or in a special situation because Rabba had received the horah from his Rebbe who was Moreh, but he could not pass on an original horah to his son. Says Rav Moshe, Klapi b'no shel Rabba nechshav hadavar l'safek, b'davar shenechleku bo gidolim. Gidolim means the Moreh horah. He's got one Moreh horah, that's Rabbi Yochanan, he's a gadol. The Kula, he's got the local Moreh horah, the greats of Bavel, the Chumrah. Is therefore Havile Sveka Doraisa, as far as the ben of Rabba Bar Bachana, it becomes a suffix Doraisa, and therefore Yeshlo Lahachmir B'Dover Zeh. Fascinating that Rav Moshe understood not that Rabba just happened to see and witness his Rebbe Rav Yochanan eat Chelev HaYeser, but moreover he asked him, and he received Rav Yochanan's horah. Now, if the Rebbe has a horah, which means he made a decision based on analyzing and using his svara and all his, all the midos shatar nidreshes behen, then he could pass on that original horah to his Talmud. But other people who never got that horah, they can at best know about the existence of the horah, and if no one else disagrees with that horah, they could rely on that horah l'kula. But if there's other dissenting moreh horah, they came up with the chumrah, then they're in a situation of a suffix, and suffix doraisa. Now we don't have much time, but I just want to introduce the next piece of Gemara. The Gemara is going to tell us that in a different story, in a different scenario, Rabba Bar Bachana contradicted himself. And the Gemara is going to bring a psak of Rabbi Akiva with regard to sfichin. Sfichin are fruits or vegetables that grow on their own without necessitating planting, etc. And Rabbi Akiva is of the opinion that sfichin are asur min haTorah after a certain period of time, which is called zman BIyun, when that species is no longer out in the fields. And there's one exception to that rule. There's one vegetable which Rabbi Akiva was matir sfichin even after the zman BIyun, and that's kruv. Cabbage, I guess. And the Gemara is going to quote a machlokes tanoim how to understand Rabbi Akiva. And would Rabbi Akiva go as far as to say that kruv is mutter, or would he agree that at least midrabanan, since all the other vegetables are asur after shas habiyur, even though they're sfichin? That's Rabbi Akiva's shita, that sfichin is asur min haTorah. Therefore, the Rabbanan are making gezerah, they're going to prohibit the sfichim of kruv to other sfichim, which are also doraisa. Or did Rabbi Akiva go all the way and he was matir in the case of kruv sfichim? And that's going to be a machlokas tanoim within the shita of Rabbi Akiva. And the Gemara now is going to quote Rabba Bar Bachana with regard to this machlokas tanoim. And he's going to be contradicting the very psak, the very horah that he gave his son with regard to Chelev HaYeser. So Mitzvah Hashem, we'll pick this up. We'll pick this up tomorrow. So we're on the bottom now of Daf Nun Aleph Amud Aleph. The Gemara's language is upliga didei. In other words, that which Rabba Bar Bachana instructed his son, he himself contradicts himself. Tiomar Rabba, Sachli, Rabbi Yochanan ben Elazar, Pamakas Nichnasti Acha Rabbi Shimon, ben Rabbi Yossi, ben Lakonya, Legina, They went into a garden. The Natal and Reb Shimon ben Yossi took Svichei Kruv, the Ochal. He had no compunctions or reservations about eating Svichei Kruv, the Nasan Li, and he gave me Rabbi Yochanan to eat these Svichim, the Amali B'ni. B'fanai, you can eat them only in my presence, but Shalom B'fanai Lo Tocha. And Reb Shimon ben Rabbi Yossi explains to Rabbi Yochanan ben Elazar the difference between the two. Anira, you see, it's Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, Sha'achal, I testify, I saw Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai eating Svichei Kruv. And therefore, Kedaihu, Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, Lismach alav lichnos olav b'fanav, and Shalom b'fanav. But Ata, you did not see Rabbi Shimon himself eat it, these Kruvim, is b'fanai echol, Shalom b'fanai lo tochal. Now here we see a contradiction to Rabba bar Chana, because he says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan ben Elazar that even if he saw the minig of heter from somebody, if that person is not roy lahoros b'dava, he would not be matir him mitochli mudot svarasa. So he doesn't have an original horah, but nevertheless, for fun of at least, he can be somech on him, because he witnessed an Adam Gadol, be like Reb Shimon ben Rabbi Yossi, that was matir for Rabbi Yochanan ben Elazar to eat b'fan of Svichei Kruv. And even Reb Shimon ben Rabbi Yossi, was not matir mitoch limudo svarasa. It wasn't original horah, and yet Rabbi Chana says to his son, in our case, that he shouldn't be somech on his minhag, even b'fanav, because the heter was not a result of svaraso v'limuda. It was only because he saw Rabbi Yochanan. So B'Yitz Hashem, tomorrow we'll pick up this deal. Okay, then we'll stop. We are now up to. We're going to review again this Gemara Pliga Didei on the bottom of Nun Aleph.